Hi everyone, my name is Emily and I'm one of the programmers at the Maysles Documentary Center. And if you're not familiar with the organization, we're a nonprofit cinema and education center founded by Albert Maysles. Usually I would say that we're located up in Haarlem, which is where we screen documentaries in a 51-seat theater and also offer documentary filmmaking education programs for young people in Haarlem. Of course, right now we're not physically there, but under these new circumstances, we've been able to continue our operations online. So we've been screening documentary runs and curated series on our virtual cinema. There's a complete list of all of our upcoming programs on the website. It's actually been kind of a cool experiment in some ways because we went from a one screen micro cinema to being able to screen multiple movies at one time. So that's been kind of fun for us to explore. And we also have been able to move our education programs to a remote learning platform. So our classes have been able to continue as well. And I'm very delighted to introduce today's Q&A between filmmaker Mark Street and writer Phillip Lopate. We've been screening Mark's films, his feature Work Songs and a short Happy, as part of an ongoing series that we're running called Joli Maysles, which is available on our website through the month of May. And Joli Maysles takes its name from Chris Marker's Joli Mai, which is a documentary portrait of Paris just after the ceasefire between France and Algeria. And the film uses on-the-street interviews to reflect on happiness and in turn to situate people's personal well-being within a larger context of political struggle and historical events. So the series itself that we've been running looks at lineages between the Joli Mai and several other repertory and new release documentaries, some of which pay homage to Marker and sometimes challenge him. And I think overall sort of continue on this tradition of capturing the collective memories and anxieties and desires that sort of constitute a time and place. So if you want to tune in again, this Saturday, there's going to be another Q&A with Mark and several of the other participating filmmakers, Brett Story, who's showing her film The Hottest August, Gordon Quinn, who's screening Inquiring Nuns. So that's this Saturday at 4 p.m. So just if you want to put that on your calendar as well. And with all of that in mind, I'm going to introduce today's panelists. Mark Street, he's the filmmaker of Work Songs and Happy, graduated from Bard College and the San Francisco Art Institute. He's shown work at New York's Museum of Modern Art, in the Cinephobe series, at Anthology Film Archives, Millennium, the San Francisco Cinematheque, and many, many film festivals around the world. His work ranges from the abstract to improvised narrative feature films, and he is assistant professor of film in the visual art department at Fordham University. And Mark is going to be in conversation with Phillip Lopate, who's a film critic, writer, and educator. His newest book, The Glorious American Essay, is going to be coming out this fall, and he's currently a professor at Columbia University's School of the Arts. So the last thing I'll say is just that if you have any questions while they're in conversation, please feel free to put them in the chat. And then once they open it up for audience questions, I will read questions from the chat and they will be able to address them specifically. So I guess without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Mark and Phillip. Thank you.
So Mark, I'll start in a general way and ask you what was the inspiration for this film?
You know, I saw it as sort of a road movie in some ways. And work is interesting to me, as I know it is to you, as a sort of lens through which to look at people's lives, their economic lives, their sense of happiness, contentment, their place in the world. And it sort of came out of a dinner table conversation when you're having dinner with people you don't know very well. And if you ask them, what's the weirdest job you ever had? People can talk for hours. So I sort of felt like, you know, I'd been sort of preparing to make this film for a long time without knowing it. And you'll notice in the film, I asked that question to the interviewees a lot. You know, what's the strangest experience? Tell me something that happened to you at work.
I remember once when you when your family and mine were up in Vermont, we had a whole dinner conversation about getting fired from jobs.
Exactly. That's another great question.
But it hasn't been that prevalent in your work before, I think.
Well, it was in Happy, of course. You know, I mean, it's not a film about work, but it's a film about working people in the streets of New York. I went around and asked them if they're happy, and a lot of them were UPS drivers, and there's an iron worker in there. And I sort of tried to keep with the blue collar milieu of Marker and Jean Rouch in terms of, you know, talking to people as they work. Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that interests me, and it's again, I think if people are working almost, you know, when I film people who are working a lot. I made a film in Lima, Peru called Lima Limpia, and I was filming street sweepers. You know, they had this sort of balletic way of moving through the city, and there's something about, you know, it's almost like they're not conscious of themselves. People aren't conscious of themselves when they're actually performing work. So I find it, in a voyeuristic way, I find it an interesting site for filming.
Yeah, you mentioned Chronicle of the Summer and the Joli Mai. How much were you thinking about them when you're doing this project?
You know, there's such great films. It's hard to. They were just departures. In fact, I looked at Le Joli Mai again today for the third or fourth time, but it wasn't something that I looked at before making this film at all. It's just something in the back of my mind. I think what inspires me most about both of those films is the sense of play, and the sense of spontaneity and improvisation, and asking people questions and being direct with people and following sort of following your instinct in terms of what to ask people and how to film them and things like that.
Yeah, something that occurs to me in watching your film is that you're fascinated with physical processes, you know, and that's not necessarily the case with the Marker film or the Rouch film. They're engaged in photographing interviews, but some of the most lyrical and beautiful passages in your film are just where the camera is showing people doing a certain work process. And of course, films have a magical ability to focus on that kind of materiality, on any kind of process, you know, cooking or sweeping or anything like that. And so lots of times your film drifts into this kind of watchfulness, watching material processes.
Yeah, that was interesting to me. I mean, I think I went out to California and spent about a month there. And for instance, in looking at the longshoremen, you know, getting these containers off ships, the crew and I, and these are people I've known for 30 years. I went to Bard with Eric Sachs and Phoebe Sudrow. You know, we just spent days, you know, driving around trying to figure out what the as you said, what the process is. All right, you know, they put the container there, and then the train picks it up and all that. And it was the same in Pittsburgh, the automatic vehicle landscape up there. You know, I tried almost in a Wiseman sense. You know, the way he looks at something from the beginning to the end. You know, I just thought, how does this work? How does this automatic vehicle system work? You know, not the engine, but how does it work economically? So that was interesting to me. And of course, the film ends with that factory.
Right.
And there's a, you know, sort of day in the life of a factory, and you know, it's like the rhythm of a day. You know, it starts out a certain way, it you know, goes to a different place. And I'm interested in that kind of overview of a workday.
Well, you know, you mentioned Fred Weissman, and there are moments that are like Weissman that are not like Marker and Rouch, because suddenly you're not questioned. In fact, sometimes, you know, there's something very intermittent about who you ask questions to and who you just photograph and let talk. So, I mean, at the beginning, in fact, the guy is just talking, and you're not asking the guy questions. So one thing is that, of course, Weissman would always pick a kind of institution to focus on. You had a different kind of structural problem, a structural challenge, in that you were photographing people in all these different areas of work. So you were all over the place geographically and occupationally. What kind of challenge was that in terms of structuring it?
The absolute biggest challenge, right? Because it couldn't be completist. It couldn't deal with every job, all jobs. It had to be a mix. It had to be a mix between white collar, blue collar. I think it has a tropism towards the blue collar rather than the white collar. There was geography to consider. There was kinds of work and things like that. And I ended up, basically editing the film was all about shuffling the index cards, saying what goes with this. And it was almost like grouping these interviews and then tailoring them to fit the sections that were in my mind, union, automation, union issues tied in together, the gig economy, work-life balance, manual labor as something that's exalted. Near the end, I ended with people who had figured it out in some ways. The sort of night crawler photographer. He's a gig worker, but he has this whole life that goes on outside of his work. So that was the way I put it together in the end. And I had to trim things and I had to tailor things to meet the structure as it moved.
I also think that you managed a kind of balance by. There are certain people who are very charming in the film, and you sprinkled them through. You didn't put them together in a way, like the taxi driver, for instance, or the crossing guard, or the barista. So you sprinkled them, but I noticed you didn't have many professional jobs, like lawyers or teachers, doctors. Was there a reason for that?
Some of it just a lack. Another was that I couldn't figure out a way to make them visually appealing in some ways. I had a nurse in there, and I couldn't get any B-roll. It's hard to get into a hospital, right? Obviously. By the way, I looked for some B-roll on YouTube. There's all these really terrifying videos. Like, how do you put an IV in a patient? And you can imagine these nurses, doing their homework in the back room before putting in their first IV. I have the 2 Seattle workers, tech workers, and I have an architect, but I don't have teachers, and I skewed towards the blue collar for sure.
I mean, it's interesting with the architect because one of the themes in the movie is, for want of a better word, craft knowledge and how it's passed down. And the architect says, well, I still use a pen, I still draw everything, I still sketch by hand, and he knows that all of his younger workers in the office just work on the computer. And so the whole notion of craft, like the woman who teaches teenagers to woodworking, it's again this celebration of being of craft, but also there's a lot in this movie about, since we said there are no teachers, there's actually a lot about mentor and apprentice passing down information. The movie begins with this guy who's training kitchen workers. There's a woodworking woman, and then there's a farmer who says, millennials, you love them, you hate them, he loves the fact that they're idealistic, he hates the fact that they're so impatient. So it seems like there's a lot in this movie about passing down knowledge.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I started with education and I ended with education. Started with the chef, trainer, and this notion of hard skills and soft skills and things like that, and then ended with a farmer who says what you just said. Yeah, it's interesting. You know, the architect you mentioned, you know, there's a case where he's working with his hands, but he's also sort of threatened by automation or computer things, you know, and he's handing off something to the younger worker who's making it legible to the world or something. So my hope was that these categories or the flow of the film, you know, that it transcended those categories as well. And, you know, a union worker could also be talking about, you know, working with her hands as well as other things. And the architect could sort of reach back to this theme of the computer taking over and taking away jobs. When I say the architect, you know, I worry for him a little bit. He seems sort of like me on Zoom, you know, out of his element.
Well, you know, I thought about Marx and the whole notion of alienation of labor, and curiously in the film it seems as though the industrial workers who Marx was talking about are less alienated, and the ones who are getting alienated are the ones who are stuck behind a computer. And an example is the woman who's a longshoreman and says, you know, I used to be able to do so much more in planning, and now I'm just behind a computer. And of course the gig workers and the woman who says, when you're working at home, you can't make a division between you're on clock all the time, you know. So basically the new alienation comes about through automation and through the internet.
Yeah, I felt that as well. Although the woman who's working from home surprised me in that, you know, I sort of went into that interview expecting to hear someone who craved human contact more.
No,
and she said, no, I like it. I can be in my own house and things like that. So that was important to me, you know, in making the film is obviously not looking for predetermined answers and letting people share their experience, although it was contrary to my sense of what their experience might be.
well, you know, you must have you started out with certain political opinions, and that sort of comes through when you interview the old wobbly, the international workers. You know, you know, you have that song in the background, dump the bosses off your backs. So you seem to be wobbly at that moment.
Yes. I wobble. Yeah, I mean, obviously that's where my heart is, you know, but you know, but there are, well, one of the things I decided to do is dump the experts off my back in making it. I had all these experts talking about labor and talking about Marxism and talking about the sort of macro world. And I just winnowed all that out and focused in on people's experience. So rather than people talking about work, I wanted them talking about their own experience.
Yeah, I think there really, from what I could see, was mainly one expert, Matthew Crawford, who was talking about craft knowledge.
Yeah, and you know, again, I had to cut him because he sort of starts with his own experience. You know, he sort of says, I've had a number of cubicle jobs, they weren't satisfying. But he's a published author from Shop Class is Soulcraft, you know, great book about, you know, this sort of, you know, investment we have in how manual labor can be edifying and things like that.
So you obviously start from a kind of left-wing democratic socialist perspective, it would seem to me. But some of the so-called bosses that you interview are actually quite benevolent, idealistic, and so the old veteran may be saying, get the bosses off your back, and they just want to squeeze the profits out of you. But because you concentrate on the kinds of settings that you do, a lot of the bosses seem to be teachers.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the surprises of the film, and for me, you know, again, you know, I wanted the material to take me where it took me. And I think, as you say, my own politics come through, but there are enough films out there that, you know, that espouse the sort of political position you're describing. So I wanted this, the stories to transcend the actual labor and to you know, to be more complicated in some ways.
And what kind of complications were they?
Well, I mean, I mentioned the well, you know, the farmer who you know, had all these problems I didn't know, I hadn't thought about before. I hadn't thought about how, you know, I think of this as a sort of back to the table, not back to the table, farm to table.
Yeah,
yeah. And he was like, "Are you kidding? People don't want my chickens because they, you know, they don't want to touch the meat. They want pot pies and things like that." That was a surprise to me. Yeah, there are people who spoke outside of, you know, the crossing guard who, you know, is in our neighborhood. You know, there's a whole world in there, and the bartender at this really wonderful bar, Jimmy's Corner in Times Square. Sadly, Jimmy just died a couple weeks ago. But you know, I met her there. I was stopping to have a drink before a show at Town Hall, and I thought, she's got a whole life outside of this bar. And indeed, as you know, she's a voice actor. So, you know, I guess one of the things, you talk about surprises, or you ask about surprises, you know, I think as you wander through the world and you see somebody pouring your coffee or sweeping this street or teaching your kid or whatever, you know, if you think about, you know, all that they're doing and the fact that there's labor involved in all these activities, that's the kind of opening up I was hoping for the film to have.
Yeah, well, the tone of the film is that people are shown as having a lot of dignity through their work, and in general they're shown as I don't know if loving their work is the right word, but certainly attached to their work, and proud of their work. And then there's this other theme of, but there's more to them than just their work. So they're trying to establish a work and after hours balance that will make sense. They can express themselves. That is another Marxist idea, that, you know, we work in the morning and we write poetry at night, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think it's, I didn't see many malcontents, many cynics in the film.
No, I guess not. I mean, there's people who are up against it. I mean, the UPS driver and the kind of, you know, micromanaging, aggressive, you know, management harassment, as he calls it.
Yeah,
that's a shock.
They're timing him and trying to squeeze the most work they can get out of him.
Exactly. By the way, Ken Loach's last film, Sorry We Missed You, is about it's not named, but, you know, sort of a UPS like outfit, and the workers doing just that, running from one call to another, unable to talk to the customer. Again, less FaceTime all over the place. Yeah, but then he tells this weird story about, you know, something that happened to him at work, the weirdest delivery he ever had. So, you know, I was looking for people who are proud of their jobs, but there are also people who are definitely up against it. The guy
also got a great cat in the back.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. That was an actor.
I wanted to ask you something about the cinematography. You used a lot of. It seemed like you used several cinematographers, but the film felt fairly seamless to me visually. How'd you manage that?
Well, you know, I wanted this sort of macro micro thing going on. You know, you talked about the processes earlier, and I wanted to, like the farm, for instance. By the way, I shot the farm myself, no assistant. You know, I just was there for 3 days in Swoop, Virginia, wandering around. And you know, by that time I sort of knew what I wanted. I knew I wanted to show I knew I wanted to show how the farm worked a little bit. And I knew I wanted to let this guy, Joel Salatin, speak, who's a really, you know, published several books and a real media savvy person. But I just tried to have an interplay between the macro and the micro, and you know, place each worker within a larger field geographically, and then allow them to speak and allow these interviews to be sort of talk sessions, real exchanges and real conversations, not interviews. I actually, for the interviews, really, a big discovery was that I needed to prepare less and listen more.
Yeah.
And just, you know, I started out with legal pad with 12 questions. And by the end, I was taking no piece of paper with me, and just letting them, not being afraid of silences, and letting people go where they wanted to go. So that was a real revelation to me, that, you know, I wanted to listen.
So since you are such a fine cinematographer, you were not tempted to shoot the whole thing yourself? Was it because you couldn't ask the questions and shoot at the same time?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I guess no is the short answer. However, I did notice when I was working with the crew in San Pedro, California, much as I loved them, I always snuck out by myself at night with the camera to get these sort of off the cuff interviews. So I guess in terms of consistency, circling back, I just wanted to get that mix right of, you know, sort of on the street, in the gas station interview, the guy with the oil tank or something, right, and sit down interviews. And I thought, as long as I created a field where both of those things, where we could accept off the cuff, guerrilla style interviews and sit down interviews, prepared interviews, you know, it would all work out. You know, one of the things I considered was in a reflexive way, backing up and dealing with the work of the crew as a kind of, pardon me?
A meta, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, I did a couple cuts that way, and it felt forced. But I did go back and add more of my voice. At one point, I'd cut myself out completely, but I thought it was important to have this character, you know, this kind of persistent, right, you know, character asking the questions.
But you didn't put yourself on camera.
I didn't put myself on camera, but I put my voice. Yeah, I sort of consciously didn't put myself on camera from the beginning. So.
And how about the use of cutaways? I mean, how did you control that? What was that all about?
Again, it was tough in spots. You know, I couldn't get on the docks, obviously. You know, so I tried to just sort of separate each shoot into an ambient, you know, shoot, you know, some of which I was doing myself alone. And then these interviews, which were lit, you know, with DPs and with the DP and things like that. And then, you know, try to figure out some mix so that I had in San Pedro, I had enough of California, I had enough of those highways, I had enough of the boats, and I could just cut away to them when it seemed to make sense. So I had this, you know, treasure trove, I think, of place and then of interview, and I just tried to, you know, get the mix right.
You have one interview with a guy named Corey who is kind of a mess, and he's self-destructive, and he has problems with drugs and alcohol. That was the only interview that you followed up with 6 months later. How come you did that one time, coming back to this one guy?
It's so interesting. It probably a flaw. You know, they say if you do something once, it's a mistake. Twice, it's a mannerism, and 3 times, it's part of the film or something. But I was interested in going back to him because he was in flux when I interviewed him. You know, it was likely that the farmer and the educator, chef educator, and the Uber driver were doing the same thing. 6 months later or 8 months later. And I knew it was highly unlikely that this man was doing the same thing. He was so on the edge when I first interviewed him. And indeed, when I went back 6 months later, he'd done 7 things. He'd done 7 things in 6 months, you know. He did seasonal work for FedEx, and, you know, the paycheck wasn't what he expected and all these things. So that was that one instance, you know, of wanting to see how things had changed for him. And I didn't feel like going back to the others would have been as interesting. By the same reason that he was up against it, I think more than anyone else in the film, I felt like it was important to check back and see how he was evolving.
Well, he was the most unstable, and indeed, when you came back, he looked pretty bad actually physically. 6 months later. The one difference I think between a film like this and the Chris Marker or the Rouch Morin is that they were much more invested in placing the subjects in a political and historical context, and you seem not to want to do that actually.
Yeah, I wanted it to come out in different ways, I guess. You know, no matter which way I tried to slice it, it felt like I was squashing their anecdotes. And I think, you know, the glory of Marker and Rouch is that they're able to do both, you know, and they're able to sort of give the macro world and then allow people to wend their way through it. But I just sort of felt like that was off screen. That was the elephant in the room, as people say. You know, the oil worker who's seen all these fluctuations in his salary and things like that. I almost thought it was better not in there or something. Yeah, same thing in a kind of lead up to this film called Oil Towns, about oil workers in North Dakota. You know, I didn't want to deal with the politics or the environment, really. I wanted them to talk about their experience as temporary workers there. And it was a choice, you know. I don't think I even tried to talk about politics with them.
No, there's only one guy who refers to Trump. He doesn't say Trump, but it's the one who has his own auto repair shop, and he says that that there's a problem because the undocumented people with cars don't want to take them in because they're afraid of being, you know, ejected from the country.
Exactly. Yeah, and I liked it in there. I'm glad he said it. And by the way, he is the personification of what we should want as a North American, right? I mean, he came here, he started his own business, he moved up, he wants his kids to go to college. You know, I mean, to me, his whole being is a refutation of Trump.
Speaking of wanting his kids to go to college, you asked a number of them what they wanted for their kids, and that seemed to be another leitmotif in the film.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of classic, you know, American dream. You know, for people to do better than we do, and again, you know, it was a way to get people to talk outside of themselves. You know, it was a way for people to talk about the future rather than saying, as Marker asks, you know, what do you see for the future? You know, you ask about their kids, and they sort of, you know, they sort of project onto their kids or say, you know, this is what I hope for them.
Yeah, speaking of the future, there's this episode with in Pittsburgh with driverless cars, you know, and one guy was interviewed. He said, "Well, how do you feel about this?" And he says, "It's going to happen. The future is the future, you know."
Yeah.
What are you going to do? The future is the future.
Yeah. And that guy works in a parking lot, so you know, one of the good things about driverless cars is that there won't be so many parked cars or need for parking or whatever. That's the utopian view of it. So he's sitting there in a parking garage, you know, presumably his own job would be threatened by this future. And I thought that was an interesting and optimistic, you know, viewpoint. You know, I started in Pittsburgh because I thought Pittsburgh was really representative, both as with its Rust Belt past, and then this alliance between Uber and Carnegie Mellon and city of Pittsburgh to develop this green technology. So I went pretty deep into what what that technology is, and what people are afraid of, to the extent they're afraid of, and all that. And I ended up shortening it down to that cab driver's experience and things like that. But I spent quite a bit of time there, and I thought about making it just about that.
Actually, there may be four people who are in the film that refer to it. One is the sort of technocrat who's explaining it all. The other is the cab driver. And then there's the woman who says, you see these guys going around the neighborhood, and then you just have a brief shot of graffiti thing, basically, fuck Uber. Yeah. So it could have taken over the whole film in a way, but you controlled it in one place.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a 40 or 50-minute cut of just Pittsburgh, and I drove in a car, and I had that experience, and I was interviewing a guy as he was, driving a car with his hands not touching the steering wheel and all that. And I just kept, the more other things I got, I thought it was more interesting in relation to the other parts than it was as a standalone section.
Yeah, well, the whole point of view of the people that you interviewed seemed to be, they wanted their jobs, they were proud of their jobs, they were not looking forward to a utopian workerless future.
Uh-huh. I agree. Yeah. I'm trying to think if I interviewed any malcontents along the way, but I was just drawn to them more. I was drawn to people who had something, who found some psychological sustenance in what they did.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about this guy I know, Jim Livingston, who wrote this book called Fuck Work.
Right.
And the whole point of view was that the economy had reached a point where you really didn't need people to work, and automation was coming. So why not have a guaranteed annual income and people didn't have to work? And it's obvious that, to me anyway, I am in fact a self-confessed workaholic. It's obvious to me that people want to work not just for the money, but for the sense of identity, and that it gives them a kind of integrity.
Yeah, I think I've been thinking about it in these shelter in place times. Whoever thought that people who didn't like their jobs actually miss whatever contact that was, or reason to get out of the house or whatever, as well as people who are finding non-paid work for themselves in their home, are making something out of nothing, and occupying themselves in a way that's meaningful and is its own kind of work as well.
Well, it's a beautiful film. You really should feel proud of it. It's a good piece of work. And we can take questions if there are any.
Yeah, so I'll hop back in, and maybe I'll ask a question while people formulate questions. And again, feel free to just type them directly into the chat, and we'll see them and be able to address them. But I just have a question in the meantime that sort of relates back to like what you were talking about at the beginning, and just kind of like the film's conception of work. And obviously it showcases a wide range of work, and therefore a wide range of sort of feelings about work. And one thing that was really fascinating to me is just how differently people were relating to sort of their own labor, their own leisure time, their bosses, their alienation, the value of their labor. And I was wondering if for you as a working artist in the process of making this film, if you felt like it impacted the way you conceptualize your own work or relationship to your work.
I'm in Philip's camp in terms of being a workaholic, where we meet in a church basement sometimes. And, it's been interesting in this time, like to keep going and to keep generating. And, I guess, I guess I saw myself, I guess I wanted to make this film in a workman-like way, a work person-like way. I wanted to just keep accumulating, and I'd finish one shoot and I'd say, what else can I get? Where else can I go? What else can I do? And I wanted it to be, I kept wanting to add to it. I kept wanting, it was almost like something that accumulated in that way. And, I'd look at it over and over and I'd say, there's something missing. I have to go here. I have too much of the Northeast, or I have too much, too many, too much of the Union. And what about someone who works remotely or whatever? And it really just felt like I don't know. I guess I realized how much I love working, how much I get out of it, even if no one else sees it in a weird way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So we have a question from Ira, who asks, how do you feel about the subjects in the film as you think about them during these times? Can you imagine making a follow-up given how everyone's lives have changed, and in particular around their jobs and their labor?
Thanks, Ira. Yeah, I mean, we're all working remotely. So that's one thing that one way I look at the film differently now. Again, as I said earlier, just sort of the idea of filling time, the idea that, we wake up in the morning and what are we going to do with that day? Where are we going to find value in that day? Paid value, or intellectual value, or cultural value. So it's made me think a lot about work-life balance, I guess. It seems like the door is never closed in terms of emails and things. It never was, but even more. And part two, yeah, people have asked me that before. I think this thing could go on in a weird way, but I'm not ready yet. But I think I could see a series or something, or interviewing people, maybe even in a more informal way. Quick questions about work and how it evolves.
And I think sort of adding on to that, Alan is asking about sort of within the context of now, and specifically with like mass unemployment, and sort of different reasons, like what the kind of call for work reflects, whether that's for people's livelihoods, or he's saying dignity, pride, self-esteem, emotional connection, and identity. So if our circumstances now have changed the way that you see work, or change the way you see your film.
I'll just speak for a moment. So I'm a writer and a professor, and I consider myself as a writer very lucky in that we're essentially introverted people who are used to staying at home and sitting in front of a typewriter or a laptop. And so I know, in speaking to my other writer friends, that there's much less adjustment to sheltering in place for a writer than for a lot of other people. Of course, I've had to make an adjustment in teaching by teaching through Zoom, but even that hasn't been that much of a problem. And I think the big way that I feel fortunate is that I don't have a boss over me. I'm my own boss. And so sometimes when I listen to younger people, and they seem to be, when they have jobs, they seem to be fighting for the time away from their jobs. I realize that when you're a writer, even when you're not writing, you're writing in your head. You're writing all day long, and even almost into your dream life. So that there's not as much of a problem of separating work and life. You know that it's all, that's what you're going to do. you know. And so, so that whole question of being your own boss is an important one, I think. Not always possible.
Yeah, and I think that that relates to another question that appears, which is about the fact that a lot of people aren't working remotely right now, either have lost their jobs or are still working as essential workers, and you know, in turn remain the most vulnerable workers. So I was asking, what percentage of your subjects do you think have lost their jobs within the last few months, and if you've been thinking about that?
You're right about that, Ira. I'm saying a lot of us are working remotely now. I'm looking over the list of subjects here, and I think that, oddly, quite a few of them were essential workers. You know, the farmer, the Uber driver, some of the gig people in the gig economy, not so much. The longshore women, definitely essential workers. Definitely didn't at all shut down. I know because I heard from them. So a mix.
And I guess Patrice is asking about how you see work changing in the arts right now in particular. And they're thinking about novels, plays, and other art that's been made during times of crisis.
I'm really appreciating the community and the kind of dialogue that's happening right here, and the fact that the film is streaming for 3 weeks or the month of May. So I think there's all sorts of opportunities out there. I've been listening to jazz concerts, Blue Note Jazz Club. You know, people will perform something in their home, and it's oddly intimate, and it's not like being there, but there's something sustaining about it. It's a good question. I mean, I think artists adapt to any environment, and like a lot of artists, I've been trying to. I mean, my work thrives on dense New York and on travel. So I'm kind of like trying to figure out what it's like to shoot in the backyard, or, you know, on my front steps, or, you know, make collages out of the newspaper headlines or something like that. So there's always things to do. And I think the kind of, format of things has changed for right now, for sure.
And I think that relates a little bit to Andy's question, which is about the film's sort of style and approach as more realist than other work that you've made, which is maybe has more improvisational or performative or different kinds of imagery. So Andy's wondering how you decide what type of imagery to use for a project.
Well, great. Thanks, Andy. Andy Black came to Seattle with me and shot that material out there. So all the macro world of Seattle and the interview with the tech workers is all Andy's doing. This is my least formally inflected film. I was going to say invented, but it's the one that calls attention to itself least, I think, in terms of a style, in terms of mannerisms. And that was conscious. I mentioned the word workmanlike. I sort of wanted, it felt right for the aesthetics of it to be transparent to the extent that aesthetics are transparent. I wanted people to look through the camera work and look through the film and hear these stories and meditate on them. And I wanted the artistry of it to be in the combination of the themes and the way the stories resonated and the themes developed over time. So, each film has its own style or something. And I think in this case, I wanted to I thought about Studs Terkel. I wanted to keep it, he doesn't overshadow his subjects. It's not about him. He's just a great listener, and he was sort of my North Star in a lot of ways.
So And so I think we've touched on this a little bit in thinking about sort of types of work that people are doing who are able to work from home. And Annabelle is asking about people's relationship to their labor when it is labor for survival and is not necessarily labor, artistic labor, or labor for personal growth. And I guess I would just add to that because Philip, you brought up sort of Marx's idea of alienation, and in the film, in some ways it seemed like, you know, people who were doing more manual labor or working with their hands were less alienated, but just like, you know, the kind of different modes of the different ways that people are kept alienated, especially when, as Annabelle is saying, it's a form of survival. You could talk about that.
Philip, you want to jump in?
Well, certainly, you know, there are lots of the examples in the movie of people being alienated often have to do with like the UPS driver or the guy who works with the oil truck, is that their bosses are trying to minimize their contact, the human contact, and trying to it's a speed up process basically. And so the alienation is coming from not being able to control the pace of your own work. There can't be anything more alienating than that. So, I mean, some of the other people, you know, they may be discontented in other ways, but you know, like the barrister is going to take as long as it's going to take to make a cup of coffee, or he's a waiter or whatever he is. But these other people, they're really under the gun, you know. So that's the downside of capitalism. It's, you know, it's the speed up.
Yeah, or the fact that they're, you know, everyone's making products that are participating in the production of products that are not for their own use, or that they're not the ones consuming.
On the other hand, the shirt factory seems like a very happy place, actually. It seemed to me, am I imagining this, but in an earlier cut, which I saw, I thought there was more of a point that the workers were given different jobs and moved around more, right?
In the factory, you mean?
Yeah.
I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
But yeah, we talked about that a fair amount. It's a pretty happy factory in some ways. You know, so that's sort of, you were talking about unexpected things earlier. That sort of goes against, you know, a sort of type we have of a factory with, you know, dark walls and people suffering and things like that. No, but I don't think people moved around as much. I think there was a fair amount of, I don't know, I interviewed that woman about her favorite color or something. Ellen mentioned
That was great. I like that.
You know, and it was just, I don't know, these sort of tender shoots of contentedness through a workday.
The factory was set up in such a way that it was not like a automobile conveyor belt. It was various small areas, and that meant that people could get into their work without necessarily, you know, feeling like they were just, you know, in a slaughterhouse, so to speak.
True.
Okay, so I think we have time for two more. I'm gonna just ask them both together. So Maura is asking about the intertwining of certain people's stories, specifically Roxanne, Michelle, and Morin, and how by intertwining their stories, you sort of illuminate and draw out different themes. So if you could talk a little bit more about the process of finding and drawing out those themes. And then I think we'll end with, where is it? Todd is wondering if participants in the film have seen it and how they've reacted to it.
Those are good questions. I want to ask the one about me being older too. Anyway, answer the one about me being older. Yeah, with the longshore men, they wanted to be called longshoremen. I asked them. It's a small community and tight knit. union world out there. So they all knew each other. And in fact, I got names of people from all of them. You know, everybody knew Art Almieda, the labor historian, crusty, wobbly guy. And everybody said, oh, you got to go talk to Art and things. So, you know, it was all within the same world. And, you know, I tried to sort of a relay or a tag team, you know, it was sort of like start with one story and then have Morin pick it up and then have Art give the macro world. You know, he quotes the Wobblies, you know, I don't mind the machine, I just don't want to be its victim. So, you know, that kind of adage or slogan, you know, hopefully carried through the rest of the film and you could remember it coming back to it. So again, you know, in terms of process, it was really just going out there and meeting people. You know, there were a couple bars there. I would go there and ask people if I could interview them elsewhere and things like that. And you know, sort of staying light on my feet in terms of how the film could pivot and move, I would say. And Todd wonders about the participants.
Yes, she asked about did you show it to these people and what was the response? And of course, the ending of Chronicle of a Summer, which is so great, is Morin and Rouch show the film to the people and they hate it. They don't like it at all.
Right.
And the filmmakers leave scratching their heads like, oh, well, we did the best we could.
That's right. Yeah. Well, anyway, one of the casualties of the shutdown, which is not the worst casualty at all, obviously, was that I was going to go out there and show it in a union hall in San Pedro, May 15th, I believe. You know, so that was going to be I was really looking forward to it because you know, a lot of the tight-knit community, I think, would have come out and seen it there. And Todd, as you know, I'd also planned to show it in Wilmington, North Carolina, and was hoping the factory workers could see it as well. I was hoping to show it in the factory itself. So maybe there'll be time for that. You know, I'm looking forward to showing it to them. I wanted to answer just this last question about something about me being old. No, something about how do you feel about making this film at your age as opposed to the kind of film you might have made in your 20s and 30s? I wanted to say that at one point, speaking of diversity and speaking of getting the mix right, I realized at one point I felt more comfortable interviewing people my age, which is 58, who were by and large had it figured out a little bit, you know, and I thought, well, there's something missing here. You know, I need to have younger people in it who are striving and maybe older people who are looking back, like Almieda. So it's all, you know, all these blinders when you're making a film. You think you're being all embracing, you know, in a certain way. You think you figured it all out, and then you have to sort of figure out that you have, you know, blind spots on, or you haven't interviewed, you know, you haven't cast as wide of a net as you thought you had, I guess.
Well, thank you so much, Mark and Philip, and thanks to everyone for participating. I'm just going to put a link in the chat now. If you're able to donate to Maysles Documentary Center right now, we appreciate it now more than ever. And also just remember that there's another Q&A that Mark will be participating on Saturday at 4 p.m. And the link is on our website to that as well. And he'll be talking to Brett Story and Gordon Quinn. Yeah, so I think that's it.
Thank you, Maysles. Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Kat.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
I'm just going to stay on for a second, Mark, so that people can access the link if they want to.
Yeah, I'm doing the same thing because I want to read the questions.
Okay, great. Actually, I meant to tell you this. I rewatched Work Songs a few days ago, and the thing that struck me was that the first person who's interviewed, the chef educator, that's the town that my dad grew up in.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which just felt like a funny first setting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really interesting restaurant. It's like you know, it's a fine dining restaurant.
Okay.
But the whole point is that they're trying to train these at-risk youth, and they only hire them for less than 20 hours a week because they want them to get jobs, other jobs. It's almost the reverse of job security.
Yeah.
And there's a limit, something like 6 weeks or 2 months, because they want to integrate them into the, you know, into other restaurants and things like that. I find it really an interesting spot. You know, it has that dissonance of an expensive burger and philanthropic venture.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of that dissonance, but it actually is very interesting, I think.
Totally. Yeah. It was funny. It was interesting hearing him kind of create the parallels between former life as a pastor or a priest and like a head chef, and just sort of like the organizing and the kind of charisma, and just would never have thought to make connections between those jobs.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool.
Well, I mean, I guess cooking is one of those things like manual labor that people have an emotion, you know, like it's good for the soul, or, you know,
Yeah.
chopping something or cooking something is good.
And I was wondering what your weirdest job is.
Oh yeah, is that any? Yeah, okay. Let me type it in. Oh, I can just say it. Yeah, that's right. Well, I actually wrote a companion essay called "My Working Life," where I sort of looked at all the jobs I've had from paperboy in Beloit, Wisconsin, to college professor. You know, and yeah, there's some weird things. I worked in Alaska and the canneries up there for a while. But I think the weirdest one was selling by phone, selling Olin Mills was a photography place, and it was run out of a hotel. I was 16, and you would call people out of the phone book and set up an appointment for them to come have their picture taken, and then they'd buy the pictures or whatever. So it was cold calling these people. And the woman who was my boss, that was her job, and she would order us gin and tonics from the bar, and we would drink gin and tonics and call these customers. And one time the woman said, no, I don't want a family portrait. My husband has terminal cancer. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry. I hung up. And the boss was infuriated. She said, that's exactly the time when you pushed the family portrait. Yeah, so that was a lesson.
Yeah.
Thanks for that question.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Any other questions here? All right, good. So everybody's gone, I guess.
There are a few people hanging in. Can keep chatting for a second or not. I was just, the last thought that I had was just that I guess in thinking of the spirit of Rouch and Marker, and just like the approach of kind of going out and sort of understanding a place by just sort of seeing what the general feeling is of people who are out and about, and how right now feels like a time that, you know, you can imagine being inclined to do that and just sort of try and get a general sense of what people are feeling and what people are afraid of and what they're hopeful for, but that the conditions sort of preclude that kind of interaction. So I don't know if you have thoughts about just like how you would even go about gauging the collective feeling of a place right now.
Yeah, that's such a great question. You know, I was walking by a Whole Foods the other day, and there's a line out front, and I was just taking my walk and looking by, and there were people, you know, 6 feet apart, waiting for an hour to get in the door. And I thought, wow, it'd be really interesting to talk to those people. And then I thought, logistically, this is exactly not the time to be approaching people with the guerrilla style. Has a whole different, you know, connotation now. And then I started thinking about a boom mic.
Yeah.
You know, like
6 feet long.
Exactly, 6 feet long or something, you know. So that's really interesting. I had been thinking about it. And, you know, I was looking at Le Joli Mai today, I think I mentioned, and I was just amazed at how he would, as you say, go to a place, and it's not just the macro view. He's like looking at people's feet You know, he's during a parade, all of a sudden he goes to people's feet or to people's hands during an interview, you know, and I was sort of once again inspired by that and thinking about different ways to take the temperature of a place. You know, I think the hottest August is great in that way as well, you know, literally and figuratively. So that's my challenge.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we can talk more about it on Saturday.
Love to.
So, okay. Well,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great to chat more about it.